Hello, everybody. Let's get started. I'm Nicholas Anderson. I'm a postdoc here at the Chase Center. And so I'm happy to introduce panel 12, Soul Society and Civic Struggle. So speaking first will be Jack Bevacqua, presenting on Tocqueville. Jack is a PhD candidate at the University of Notre Dame. And presenting second will be Philip Pinell, who is a faculty member at Florida State University. We'll each have about 15 minutes to talk and then hopefully some time for question and answers. So speaking first, Jack Bevacqua.
Okay. Thank you to the Chase Center for hosting this conference and inviting me. My paper is entitled "The Self-Enclosure of the Democratic Soul, Tocqueville on an Education in Infinity." Alexis de Tocqueville's account of democracy's atomizing pathologies has received no shortage of attention from recent generations of scholars. His conception of individualism, restlessness, and soft despotism, among others, has attracted commentary for decades. However, Tocqueville's account of the overarching psychology that drives these problems and explains atomization is largely overlooked. The result of this scholarly gap is not only an incomplete reading of Tocqueville's conception of democracy and its pathologies, but also limited awareness of some of the very deepest features of his understanding of politics and the human condition writ large. This paper addresses these problems in three main ways. First, I trace Tocqueville's account of the political psychological changes associated with the rise of democracy. Second, I clarify how and in what ways these changes cause atomization. And third, I develop an account of the overarching psychological condition that Tocqueville suggests breeds the various forms of atomization he diagnosed, and therefore that explains what atomization really is for Tocqueville. My argument is that individualism, restlessness, and other isolating pathologies are but single examples of a far more fundamental condition that Tocqueville observes in democracy. This condition is what Joshua Mitchell and Pierre Menant term self-enclosure. Tocqueville's French is se renfermer. I argue that the core of this condition is the loss of an orientation to and awareness of all things outside and beyond the democratic self, or more precisely, what the democratic self imagines to be itself. The result is an increasing inability to see, feel for, or encounter anything beyond what democratic people perceive as themselves or like themselves in others and the world. This, I argue, is Tocqueville's deepest and most precise conception of democratic atomization, not a retreat from others, but rather an ensnaring in likeness, and ultimately inner and outer sameness. Tocqueville presents this conception by sketching a history, unsystematically, of how equality reshapes relationships in ways that transform perceptions, desires, and imaginings between aristocracy and democracy. In the process, he identifies deeper and more transhistorical forms of self-enclosure. I will outline a few key features of his account before connecting it to education over the next several minutes, because my contention is that his account is preeminently relevant for democratic educators today. Tocqueville's narrative focuses on roughly three historical phases. The first is what I will call the pure aristocratic phase, or the Middle Ages before the emergence of equality. The second is the current democratic phase that Tocqueville observed and studied. And the third is a future democratic phase that I argue Tocqueville sought to midwife through his works based on what he saw in America. Each phase centers on particular political and social relationships that inflect distinctive motions of the soul, especially sights, desires, and imaginings. I will sketch his account of aristocracy first, as I believe it is necessary for grasping his treatment of democracy. Tocqueville starts outlining the aristocratic phase in the introductory chapter. His first remarks concern aristocracy's political and social relationships. He writes that the serfs loved their chiefs and submitted to their rigors, while the nobles and kings took a benevolent and tranquil interest in the lot of the people. Sorry, I have a lot of quotes, so I'll just do that. The result was a reciprocal benevolence in and between the different parts of the community, with each part committing itself to the others. In other words, Tocqueville argues that aristocracy was marked by a distinctively sentimental kind of disinterested devotion, and one that united its particulars. This devotion consisted in an orientation to people that aristocrats perceived as connected to, yet beyond themselves and different from themselves. The result, Tocqueville argues, is that aristocratic people were often disposed to forget themselves. Yet more than other human beings, Tocqueville argues that these perceptions and devotions extended to aristocratic people's relationships with nature and the divine. More precisely, he argues that aristocratic people saw themselves as part of a vast cosmos populated by supernatural beings who do not come before the senses, including saints, angels, cherubs, and more. Accordingly, the aristocratic self could look upward, outward, forward, and backward, and find a multiplicity of beings that captivated and enlivened it. The result was a kind of inexhaustible variableness and colorfulness that contributed to feelings of expansiveness, or what Tocqueville at several points calls the infinite. Notice the parallels between aristocratic cosmology and politics. In both cases, Tocqueville argues that people looked at the world and saw an ordered multiplicity of beings they perceived as connected to themselves, yet above, beyond, and unlike themselves, including kings and heroes in politics, and angels and saints in religion. Put differently, Tocqueville argues that the aristocratic self perceived itself to be one part of a more variegated, substantial, and interesting whole. The result was feelings of fullness and a kind of unity with others and oneself. But a closer look reveals that these feelings and perceptions were made possible by serious problems. I cannot discuss all of them today, but the deepest problem that Tocqueville finds is not in the world, but rather in the self. He identifies two examples of this problem in the introduction. The people had not conceived the idea of a social state other than their own, or imagined that they could ever be equal to their chief. Similarly, he writes that the noble had no thought that anyone wanted to wrest from him the privileges he believed legitimate, while the serf regarded his inferiority as an effect of the immutable order of nature. In other words, Tocqueville associates aristocracy with a particular and rather fixed understanding of others, the world, and oneself. This understanding proceeded from a certain awareness, or rather unawareness, of others and in turn oneself. The core of this understanding is an exaggeration of difference. But this exaggeration arose from a deeper problem, namely that aristocratic people did not have any conception of a social state or possibility for themselves in the world beyond that into which they were born. The reason for Tocqueville was aristocracy's distinctive motionlessness and social distance, which prevented people from seeing those different from themselves over an extended period of time, and therefore difference took court. The result, he suggests, is that aristocratic people had not yet encountered what he later calls the real, or the actuality of others, the world, and themselves, and all of their differences. Instead, people unself-consciously saw all things in terms of themselves, or rather one part of themselves, the part inflected by aristocracy. In other words, Tocqueville argues that aristocratic people lived in their imagination, or what he calls the ideal. Far from an idyllic kind of unity, then, Tocqueville suggests that this phrase was marked by a distinctively aristocratic form of self-enclosure, yet one that ennobled the aristocratic self by orienting it to what it perceived as beyond itself. The second historical phase, which is the last I have time to discuss today, begins when equality starts to penetrate the social state. At this point, Tocqueville suggests that everything changes and even becomes inverted. This transformation occurs with three key developments. First, Tocqueville argues that equality creates motion. Opportunities arise that had not existed, and what was closed and fixed becomes open and subject to change. The result is that society becomes agitated as people start pursuing opportunity. But even more fundamentally, the soul becomes agitated as people start conceiving of and dwelling on these opportunities, which suggests new ideas, desires, and needs that lead people to attempt to satisfy them in the world. These changes give rise to the second major development, diminished social distance. Tocqueville argues that the motion and opportunities unleashed by equality caused the hierarchies that had separated aristocratic people from one another to collapse. The result is the third key development, sight and the perception of resemblance. With the loss of social distance, people see those from different social classes and places, or their dissembab, more often. Tocqueville argues that this change causes them to compare themselves to their dissembab, which leads them to realize that those who they formerly imagined were of another species are just like them, or their sembab. In other words, Tocqueville argues that democracy transforms relationships in ways that reorients the mind from the ideal to the real. As a result, rather than the projected forms of difference that animated them in aristocracy, people began to encounter real difference in concrete others, and in turn themselves. Tocqueville argues that these changes generate and result from a wholesale psychological, cosmological, and even existential transformation. The mind is brought down from the heavens, becomes preoccupied with interests and opportunity, and people are increasingly thrown back on themselves alone. But above all, democratic people come to see those they perceived as beyond themselves in aristocracy, as like themselves, and even of themselves, which flattens their perception of the cosmos and shreds their former imaginings. Tocqueville suggests that these changes give rise to at least two significant and overlapping problems. The first is that far from satisfying the soul, these perceptions unsettle it. Put differently, people catch a glimpse of the real, but they resist it. Perhaps the central reason is that whereas aristocracy disposed people to perceive others and themselves in accord with their imaginings and desires, democrats see them up close and as they are. Accordingly, where the self once perceived limitlessness, it now sees boundedness, or the limitations presented by the real rather than the infinity of the ideal. The result is divisions and oscillations as people struggle to close the gap between the reality of others, the world, and themselves, and their imagination-driven longings. Perhaps above all, Tocqueville observes oscillations between states of self-abnegation and self-assertion. In other words, he sees democrats seeking to lose themselves in something other than themselves, and at one moment, and then at the next, attempting to subsume all things into themselves, be all things, and consummate themselves with an imagined version of themselves. Think Dionysian self-forgetting for the first, and a kind of Alcibiadean self-assertion for the second. Yet while opposites on the surface, Tocqueville suggests that these tendencies have key commonalities. The first is the longings that animate them. My contention, interpretation, is that the central longing is the desire to regain the expansiveness or the feeling of infinity that we feel we've lost with democracy, namely as we encounter the real and its boundedness. To attain this desire, we seek to flee the real and overcome its limits, both by imposing ourselves in the world and trying to remake it in our image, and by fleeing the world and withdrawing into ourselves. And yet both tendencies only contribute to the second commonality, which is the problem that perhaps most distinguishes democracy for Tocqueville, a democratic form of self-enclosure. The core of this problem is an eclipse of a sense of otherness, as democratic people perceive mere likeness, and eventually sameness, where aristocrats saw beyondness. Accordingly, where aristocracy exaggerated difference, democracy exaggerates likeness in ways that threaten to falsify the real. Yet the ultimate and ironic result of these problems is an eclipse of the feeling of infinity as we increasingly encounter nothing but ourselves, or what we imagine to be ourselves and others in the world. As a result, where aristocrats felt exaltation, democrats come to feel exhaustion. The question then becomes twofold. First, how we can regain the feeling of expansiveness that we so seek when our social state inclines us to turn away from the outside and beyond and towards ourselves. And second, if our encounters with the real can ever truly satisfy the expansiveness we so seek, or if we can only ever experience this feeling in our self-enclosed imaginings. To conclude, the deepest form of atomization that Tocqueville finds in democracy, and what I argue democratic atomization is for Tocqueville, is this condition of self-enclosure. The core of this condition is not a retreat from others or an excessive self-preoccupation, but rather an entrapment in the sameness of our stultified selves. Tocqueville suggests that this problem is particularly pronounced in democracy, a social state that he sees as having a kind of centripetal force that sucks everything into its orbit, eliminates the sense of beyondness, and makes everything feel the same. Yet Tocqueville also identifies aristocratic forms of self-enclosure, which he suggests also involve egoistic projections. In this way, perhaps Tocqueville was self-consciously describing more permanent and transhistorical problems, rather than anything particular to democracy or aristocracy. The central problem, it seems to me, is how to open the self to things it perceives as beyond itself, and more deeply, how to get us to feel for and see the infinite differences we can encounter, yet too often spurn in not only others in the world, but perhaps especially in ourselves. In many ways, this was Tocqueville's deepest goal in Democracy in America and his main intended lesson for his readers, learning how to see. And as he writes, not differently, but further. a project that demands distinguishing ourselves from things that are not ourselves and extracting difference from seeming mere sameness. Yet as much as he sees problems, Tocqueville also offers hope, or means of thinking about how to address these problems and pursue this goal. Above all, he sees that as much as we may flee from otherness and in ways desire ourselves alone, we are also sick of ourselves, or what we think is ourselves, and long for something other. And luckily for us, there is always something other, and we don't have to go too far to find it. In other words, we are not just stuck with ourselves or what we imagine to be ourselves. And I'll end with a last quote from Democracy in America. I have no need to travel through heaven and earth to discover a marvelous object full of contrasts, of infinite greatness and pettiness, of profound obscurities and singular clarity, capable of giving birth at once to pity, admiration, scorn, and terror. I have only to consider myself. If man saw himself clearly, his imagination would remain idle and would have nothing to add to the picture. But he is uncovered enough to perceive something of himself, and veiled enough so that the rest is sunk in impenetrable darkness into which he plunges constantly and always, end quote. This, for Tocqueville, is perhaps the most fundamental, necessary, and I argue, satisfying task of education in democracy, the task of self-knowledge. And far from a further ensnaring in self-enclosure, Tocqueville conceptualizes this task as the path for seeing the fullness of reality. In this way, I like to think of it as the beginning of Tocqueville's proposal for an education in the infinite. Thank you.
Good morning. The title of my talk is Civic Thought and the Problem of Political Disaffection. And I want to begin not with the talk itself, but with the story. A few years ago when I lived in Wisconsin, I was at a movie night with some friends from the Midwest, and we were watching what every couple of grad students wants to watch, the late 90s cult classic, The Big Lebowski. Many of you know it or are familiar with it. I don't expect you to have seen it to get this point. The character of the dude, who's the main character of that film, played by a long-haired Jeff Bridges, wanders through life in a bathrobe, bowling, smoking, and stumbling from one misadventure to another, almost always against his own will. He is self-absorbed, careless in his habits, and completely disconnected from the wider world. And what's worse is that he's satisfied with it. And I remember asking a friend, why didn't this movie succeed when it first came out? It was a bit of a tongue-in-cheek question, but he looks at me and says, it's kind of hard to market. People don't like looking at themselves in the mirror, was his, big reveal. And that struck me. The dude is meant to be a humorous character on screen, but he's also uncomfortable to watch in a certain sense because he embodies a vice that many of us recognize in ourselves. Not rage or violence, but apathy, disaffection. Not the kind of explosive passions that are more frequently covered in the scholarly world and in news in recent weeks, but the opposite vice, the shrug, the checked-out attitude, the refusal to check in to what is clearly one's own business. In a way, that is a much more subtle and therefore a much more pernicious vice than the explosive passions that we focus on much more readily. And when I think about my students, I'm sad to say that many of them are just one step up from the Duke on the ladder of human decency. They are not content to float through life. Quite the contrary, they want to care about politics and want to be involved in their community, but too often they just don't know how. They describe themselves as disconnected, disillusioned, or even disaffected, a term a student of mine used not too long ago, a couple weeks ago in class. Not because they reject democracy, but because they feel like it doesn't include them. One is reminded here of Aristotle's conception of akrasia, or weakness of the will, a condition where one knows the good, but fails to pursue it anyway. Many students today want to act, but their horizons of meaning make political action feel futile or tainted. What they need, Aristotle might suggest, is friendship, a civic friendship of shared excellence in which they can experience being recognized as a partner in a shared world. And that brings me to the phenomenon that animates this paper, disaffection. By disaffection, I mean the growing number of citizens who still affirm democratic ideals in the abstract, who say, yes, democracy is good, but who feel estranged from it in practice. Many still vote, they're not anti-democratic, many still care about particular issues, but when asked, they say things like, I believe in democracy, but politics doesn't really include me. Or, if I were to act or were to go vote, what difference would it truly make in this world? And that feeling of standing inside democracy, but outside its life, is what I call disaffection. And my claim is that, on the whole, scholars tend to misunderstand it. Too often, we treat disaffection as a problem of knowledge. If only citizens understood democracy more. If they had the right information, they would engage. I want to argue that disaffection is not a lack of knowledge per se, but an interpretive distortion. It is a failure of what Hans-Georg Gadamer, a student of Heidegger, called an absence of care or participatory understanding. That which is the shared co-creation of meaning that allows us to recognize ourselves in political life. Why does this matter? In liberal democracies, we depend on things that are other than formal rights or procedures. Liberal democracies rely on a term I'm appropriating largely from environmental political theory, oikophilia, or love of one's home. At bottom, love of home depends on affect, the sense that politics is ours. When that sense weakens, democracy becomes vulnerable to populists and authoritarians step into the void. So the question I want to raise today is this: how can we conceptualize disaffection in a way that takes experience seriously and that helps us imagine remedies capable of touching people's lives? To get to this, I want to begin with standard accounts of disaffection and how I think they've fallen short. Sociologists have long explained disaffection in terms of the institutional causes of lack of apathy or of lack of political participation, written with phrases including a sense of civic powerlessness or a lack of efficacy. These classic studies frame non-participation as a failure of socialization where disengaged citizens were spectators rather than agents. Later theorists emphasize rational choice. Citizens weigh costs and benefits and often conclude participation isn't worth it. And the new institutionalists showed how policy design shapes habits of participation or the lack thereof. All this work has taught us a great deal, but what gets lost is the inner struggle that motivates individuals to stay away from the political arena. Citizens appear either as passive subjects molded by institutions or as rational calculators of incentives when the thoughts going through the minds of students are not nearly so simple. What disappears is the ethical and interpretive drama people undergo when deciding whether to participate. Nina, I always get this wrong, Eliassoff's ethnography of civic groups in the US is instructive on this point. She found that people often avoided political talk not because they were apathetic or did not care, but because they were trying to preserve integrity. To speak politically felt like buying into a corrupt game. Silence was their way of holding on to dignity. The lesson here is that withdrawal is not always ignorance or laziness. Sometimes it's a stance, an ethical refusal, a way of saying, I care too much to play along. And this is where the strategy of using hermeneutics enters into the equation. A theorist named Margit van Wessel, she's Dutch, I believe, has made a vital contribution by arguing that citizens should be seen as sense makers. People interpret politics through everyday encounters, whether waiting at the DMV, watching the news, or struggling with healthcare paperwork. And they have certain judgments that emerge from their everyday encounters. Judgments that are not just abstract principles, but real stances on the political that should be taken seriously. And on this view, disaffection is not a misunderstanding of democracy, but indeed a meaningful interpretation of politics that reflects real encounters. It insists that we take citizens' understanding seriously, even when they don't fit certain preconceived molds of truthfulness, or at least that's her point. But Van Vessel's account falls short in a crucial way. In her attempt to understand citizens as sense makers, she misapplies Gadamer's hermeneutics. By seeking to understand how a variety of individuals understand the world, she divorces the study of interpretation with identifying any notion. She divorces the study of interpretation from any notion of the truth or any single account of being more accurate than another, or whether one person's understanding is more conducive to certain social conditions than another. In other words, she tends to treat all interpretations as equally valid. And here's where a more complete understanding of Gadamer helps us go further. Gadamer, building on Heidegger, who Really, he sat in on one class of Heidegger, and Heidegger hated him, but more or less took Heidegger's theory and applied it to the interpretation of philosophy. And insists that understanding always takes place within a horizon of prejudices. In other words, literal prejudgments shaped by history. These prejudices are not obstacles, but conditions of understanding. We all hold certain unquestioned beliefs that can become revealed in the midst of heated discussion. Yet not all prejudices are equal. Some prejudices open dialogue, others close it down. Some enable recognition, others block it. So instead of this account on this take on Gadamer, which I argue is too inclusive and a misreading of Gadamer's hermeneutics, I want to propose a normative hermeneutics of disaffection. The point is not only to describe how citizens arrive at their interpretations or to accept all interpretations as equally valid political stances, but also to inquire whether those interpretations sustain or corrode democratic belonging. Here's where a Gadamerian lens is crucial. Gadamer, in copying Heidegger, employs the idea of care from Heidegger, Sorge in the German. I'm no Germanist by any stance, so please correct me after. The idea of care names the basic structure of being in the world. To be human is to be thrown into a world of concerns, projects, and relationships. For Gadamer, the existential condition becomes the ground of hermeneutics. Applied to political activity, hermeneutics becomes the study of what relation to the world enables a certain output of human behavior to begin with. And this care is not individual, but communal. It's what binds us to each other, what makes understanding possible. And for Gadamer, the act of dialogue, an act that needs at least two people, resolves when those two people reach a new understanding and are transformed by it. Disaffection, then, does not follow from an absence of care. Citizens still care about democracy. In a sense, especially for those who grow up in it, they can't extract democracy from their being in the world. The problem for Gadamer is that their care becomes distorted. It loses direction, resonance, and coherence. They affirm democracy in principle, but cannot align that aspiration with their lived encounters. While they remain legally included, they feel interpretively excluded. They are in what I term existential exile, feeling as though they are aliens in a world not made for them. And that, indeed, is a sad life. Think again of acrosia from Aristotle. The acratic soul, in his account, not Plato's, knows the good but cannot will it. Likewise, the disaffected citizen may believe that democracy matters, but can't see themselves in it, and thus don't know how to participate in it, and end up choosing not to. Their horizon of understanding renders action unintelligible or demeaning. Consider two examples very briefly. One, pensions, the other, healthcare premiums. These are not just technical distributional issues. They are sites where citizens negotiate what fairness and responsiveness mean. Imagine two citizens confronted with a rise in retirement age. For one, it looks like betrayal. Ordinary contributors are sacrificed while elites are spared. Trade-offs appear arbitrary, even contemptuous. For the other, it looks like a painful but necessary adjustment. The ordinary phenomenon of institutions grappling with scarcity. The facts are the same, but the horizons make them intelligible in radically different ways. One horizon casts reform as contempt. The other is ordinary contestation. This is what I mean by an interpretive distortion. And here, a normative rather than descriptive hermeneutics matters. A purely descriptive approach treats both horizons as equally valid and as meaningful contributions to civic life and discussion. A normative hermeneutics asks which horizons sustain recognition and which corrode it. A horizon that interprets disagreement only as betrayal forecloses the possibility of democratic life. So how do we reorient our horizons? I propose three different dimensions that civic theorists should take note of. The first is to reorient citizens' care by means of dialogue. Obviously, one must create venues where citizens can encounter trade-offs firsthand, whether citizens' assemblies, structured town halls, book club meetings at the local coffee shop, or even courses on civic discourse, as many civic schools are doing. Dialogue isn't just about saying something and then going your separate ways. It's about bringing a person into community where they feel themselves known. Indeed, dialogues of this kind are not meant just to happen once. Second, there are certain virtues of interpretation that both follow from and guide dialogue. They're the virtues of openness, reciprocity, fallibility, in other words, I am not divine and I make mistakes, and the presumption of dignity in one's interlocutor. These, I insist, are civic practices. Imagine officials acknowledging sacrifices honestly and listening without defensiveness. This models Aristotelian civic friendship vis-a-vis recognition amidst disagreement, where both parties aim towards the good of the other. And you'll notice that it's participatory. It requires input from multiple parties, not just one speaking into the void. And the third aspect is temporal. Citizens often experience reforms as arbitrary shocks. Why this? Why now? Temporal scaffolds can help orient citizens in terms of how long a potentially frightening event or circumstances will last. This is often used ideally and not practically, but these are still things we should take note of. Things like why this now memos from your employer, sunset clauses, timelines linking present sacrifices to future goods. It is also helpful for integrating citizens into a world where they see themselves as continuing a legacy begun long ago. It matters the narrative that students see themselves as participating in, whether a tale of fallible but courageous and principled American statesmen, or conversely a tale of institutionalized vice. Both will inspire a certain type of citizen who responds to the world in a certain type of way. And so we should take note and be very cautious about which we choose to teach. And each of these interventions makes politics intelligible in a different register. Together they render disagreement visible as politics rather than as contempt. What follows is that the remedy for disaffection cannot be limited to information campaigns or civics courses that explain how institutions work. Those things treat citizens as minds that need correction, simply like a paper that needs editing. But if disaffection is a distortion of care, the task is to reshape the encounters where citizens meet politics. In this sense, civic education must be thought of as a formation of citizens' interpretive capacities. Institutions must design processes that embody responsiveness. Governments must practice communicative recognition, narrating trade-offs with dignity, and policy should be situated in time, rendering them intelligible across generations. And I want to conclude where I began. The dude in The Big Lebowski, seems like a jarring comparison right now, is meant to be funny because he's checked out. But democracy cannot survive. All citizens act like the dude, which anyone who's been on a college campus is a common phenomenon. Political disaffection is one of the great challenges of our age. It's not simply ignorance or rational abstention. It's a failure of participatory understanding. Citizens can still care about democracy in principle, but their horizons render their care distorted, unintelligible, and inactionable. But to conclude on a hopeful note, I think we can reorient citizens' care. The way back, so to speak, is not simply to correct their minds, but to shape their meetings through relationships, to rebuild forums and ultimately narratives where they feel like they fit in, and care can once again bind us to each other. If we do this, then disaffection, far from being the end of democracy, may become an occasion for renewing it. Thank you.
Great, so we have about 13 minutes for questions. Oh. Questions?
Great. Thank you both for those wonderful papers. I have a question for Jack. I thought that was a wonderful talk. So if I'm understanding the suggestion, it's that even the aristocratic peoples who have this sense of the cosmos, who have this enchanted sense of the world and connection through time, they are laboring under a kind of self-enclosure that it's a function of, it's all just imaginative. And then the wonderful passage that you ended with, if I'm remembering correctly, that's from the chapter on poetry. And the context there is Tocqueville has just said that we don't have aristocratic poetry had all this stuff about knights and great men and things, and Democrats, we don't do that, but that's okay actually because the real stuff of poetry is about the human soul, and then he gives that wonderful description. So putting those two together, is your suggestion that actually for Tocqueville, democracy is better suited at coming into contact with the real, that we've gotten rid of the superficiality that characterized the aristocratic imaginative sense of projection, and now we're closer to coming into contact with the infinite? Or is that's not where you want to go? Or there's a more complicated historical story going on?
Sure. So, yeah, a few different things going on there. First thought is that, yes, I do think, and I kind of follow Pierre Menant on this in his book on Tocqueville and the nature of democracy. I do think that he sees this process whereby the mind and history is coming to see the real. Pierre Menant's term for that is nature. It's coming to see, right, that democracy is natural. It's associated with nature, and that aristocracy is associated with artificiality and imaginings and these sorts of things. I'm from the chapter on poetry taking the term the real. And in terms of the question of democracy being better suited to encounter infinity, I don't think necessarily, because I think he associates this feeling of infinity and this contact with infinity primarily with the imagination, which he associates. He sees it as a trans-historical human faculty that takes different shapes, with under different historical relations in different social states. But it's predominantly an aristocratic thing. But I guess what I was trying to suggest there was that despite this loss of an orientation to these expanded imaginings, these infinite imaginings in aristocracy, he still sees places within the context of the real for a kind of infinity in the sense, and it's a question about to what extent he's, informed by Catholic categories, and so is that a heresy or something along those lines? I don't know, but so I don't mean to overemphasize, the infinity of creation or anything. But what I mean by that is a multiplicity of differences and countless differences that we can see, but that we flee from. And yeah, I have many more thoughts, but we can talk about it after.
Thank you. My question is also for Jack. Feel free to respond with, "That's just like your opinion, man." Something like that. I feel like there's a really interesting point in your talk, but I don't quite know what it is. I feel like I'm having a difficult time disentangling what's metaphor and what's contact with the infinite or seeing the infinite. That sounds kind of like metaphor. This whole getting beyond yourself, that could be a claim about social ontology, or it could be a claim about psychology, sort of like Durkheim's worry about anomie or something like that. And I'm not sure I quite know what's metaphor and what's not in your talk, but it sounds like you're getting at some interesting issues.
Yeah. So I think I'm offering an interpretation of his psychology here. And I think he thinks about psychology largely in terms of human feeling, in terms of sentiment. And so he describes these feelings of, he uses this phrase, above and beyond, outside and beyond, all over these kinds of spatial metaphors, in contrast to self and self-sameness and here-ness and, nowness and the like. And so I think he's really describing something in human experience whereby we can be oriented to something beyond ourselves and outside of ourselves, and something that we're kind of gazing upon and can feel ennobled by, versus what he sees in democracy as this kind of not merely an excessive self-preoccupation, but really a kind of self-entrapment, which I'm arguing is something like concomitant with human consciousness for him. I think ultimately it's not just a democratic thing. But yeah, so he sees these motions of the soul and discusses these motions of the soul throughout the book. It's these feelings of contraction versus expansion, these feelings of limitlessness versus boundedness. And he's a dualistic, he's French, so he deals with these dualisms, but it all kind of maps onto this category of the aristocratic and the democratic, and I think these are just ideal types for him to investigate deeper kind of psychological problems, motion and rest, etc. I had a line in my talk that I took out about Thucydides, and for Thucydides, Athens is motion and Sparta is rest, and I think he's kind of doing a similar sort of thing.
It's useful to employ ontological terms to understanding the infinite as well, I think. So seeing it as the way in which being is made known to aristocrats versus democrats. And from that you get, well, what they care about as a society, which is, for Tocqueville, I think, a fundamentally psychological problem, as Jack was suggesting.
And I think he gets from the psychology into the metaphysics.
What kind of books do you each think are particularly useful for nudging young democratic souls away from the characteristic democratic intellectual and or moral vices that you both referred to in your talks?
What's the vice you're characterizing again? Sorry. That's a good question. Depends on the character of the student and the institution, I think, as you know well. Speaking only from my own experience, I've been at 3 different large public state universities. I find that what inspires the students most is beauty and pragmatism, both those in the same semester. And so Tocqueville is very good at getting the pragmatic side while also being a nice French aristocrat who still believes in the soul, combined with Plato, who I find frustrates students appropriately to bring them out of themselves. And then a professor who dialogues with the students as opposed to seeing those as just the way we used to think is a helpful addition.
Yeah, it's a cop out here. I'm going to say Tocqueville because that was my experience, 11, 12 years ago when I took my first political theory course, and had all these feelings and thoughts and whatever, and then my professor at the time started talking about this thing, inquietude, restlessness, and I was like, that makes a lot of sense, right? And so it's like creating a certain distance, like within the self or something, whereby we can see something that is connected to us and that we see ourselves in, and that makes so much sense, but yet isn't present at hand. That isn't just right there. And so thereby that it creates that distance and opens ourselves up to something different. And I think Tocqueville is very useful for that, not just with, I see it in the undergraduates that I've taught. They understand restlessness, it's like that's their life, and then that starts to bring them out of themselves. So.
Thank you, guys. These were fantastic papers, and I'll be thinking about the issues for a while. I wanted to ask a question to Mr. Pinell, I guess I want to raise a question, a part of your analysis, when you were talking about how with these students who fall into kind of disaffection, you describe it as like their care becomes distorted. They can't perceive themselves as a participant in democratic affairs. And I guess I wonder. I mean, I might be pointing at a different problem in students, and so please feel free to tell me if I'm just like leading in a different direction. I find that with my students, who oftentimes have some kind of cynical attitude towards politics, it oftentimes is on account of I think, justifiable interpretation of, like, what they want to do is they want to do good. And when they look out on the world and they look at the possibilities of which theaters are available to them for doing good, they look at the political theaters and they say there's absolutely no way that one can achieve anything good. Maybe in my case, it's and I guess I sympathize with them. I've lived in some really messed up cities over the last couple of years. Chicago. I live in New Orleans right now, right? And if you live in a city like that, you don't want to go into the political to do good. At least not the sort of legible mechanisms of city government, so on and so forth, or other ways. You can act civically, but still. And for my students, by and large, how do you do good? You do it through technology. Right. This is for them. They want to become investors. They want to work in medical science. They want to they want to do these kinds of things. And I guess I wonder, one, if that seems right to you, that it's that it's not so much like that they're misinterpreting the political, but rather they kind of have it right, and there's something wrong with not with their interpretation, but there's something wrong with the political, perhaps. That we need to think about more seriously. Or if maybe again if I'm pointing at a different problem, and I guess there's a sort of third thing that I wonder that's kind of been hovering in my thinking on the conference as a whole, which is something like the relation between politics and technology. This is a really big problem for students, generally speaking, and I'm just sort of wondering about that issue, sort of in a larger scale. So,
Short, I would argue that students, a common vice in students is that they care about results more than the means by which they achieve those results. Spoken about at length yesterday as well in this conference. The idea that it doesn't matter, I come in with my opinions and those opinions are valid, and but there's no attempt to dissect them or dissect how different people got there. The basic idea is empathy. The first step to addressing any of those problems is to have a fruitful dialogue and open yourself to understanding the other person as having a point to be made. So to your specific question, I do think the dilemma you're pointing to is slightly different. What I mean more so is that students have they're misinterpreting how they should go about politics, and in so doing, they're like, well, maybe I have the answer. They think, or they certainly might have an opinion, or might be afraid to make an opinion. But maybe they're like, I have the answer, but it's impossible. So what's the point? That's the student that I'm targeting with this project.
Great. So we're out of time. So thanks to Jack and Phil for a wonderful panel.